A lot of free market supporters were confused after the 2008 recession was blamed on capitalism. That's because most people assume that we have a free market, when in fact the U.S. economy hasn't been free since 1913. But it is because of this mistaken belief that capitalism is blamed for the recession. We need to make a stand for freedom everywhere, even in the economy. And so to do that, we have to understand what happened in 2008. We're going to start with some economic principles, then do a brief survey of two other historical U.S. depressions and their true causes, and then we'll turn our attention to the 2008 economic collapse. So, some economic principles. These are important because we need to apply the words and ideas of economics to the real world, and so I'm going to be using a lot of the phrases and words throughout this presentation that you need to understand. So firstly, what is money? Well, money is the basis of our economy. It's also responsible for one of the most important economic developments of all time, the transition from bartering to a general medium of exchange. Now, it used to be that the dollar represented gold and silver. There was real wealth behind it, so that the paper was actually just a certificate. But that's not what we have now. Now we have the Federal Reserve printing money whenever they want. They're basically creating money out of thin air that has no relationship to real wealth, such as gold and silver. So that's a major problem, and it's caused a lot of problems in our economy, as we will see. This also leads to the next point: what's inflation? Well, inflation means to expand the money supply. You can picture this like money growing on trees. A lot of people think that'd be a good idea, but actually it wouldn't be. And why is that? Well, because of the law of marginal utility. That's a fancy way of saying the more units of a good you have, the less value each unit has. Like pencils. We have a ton of pencils all over the place, and each pencil has very little value to us. If there were only a few pencils in the world, they'd be very expensive. So if we apply this to money, if money grew on trees, it would be worthless. And I'm afraid that's where our money is heading now, with the Federal Reserve printing it up whenever they want. Another point we have to look at is time preference. Time preference is about consuming now or consuming later. It's responsible for profits and interest rates, and it's also responsible for dividing labor and money in the economy. How does that work? Well, in the economy, there's two sectors of goods. There's high time preference goods, or consumer goods, and capital goods, or low time preference goods. Money and labor is always divided between these two types of production. And this leads us to the next point: what's a recession? Well, a recession is a contraction of the economy lasting more than 6 months. That's the official definition of a recession. And we need to ask, well, what causes recessions? And back in the 1920s, an economist by the name of John Maynard Keynes speculated that animal spirits, or cycles of the moon, caused recessions. This is in the 1920s, and they had no better explanation than this. And unfortunately, it's Keynes and his teaching that's being followed by our government and being taught in our schools to this very day. Well, fortunately, some other economists have come up with a more plausible and thorough explanation of recession, so that's what we're going to look at now. We remember that money and labor is always divided between consumer goods and capital goods. In the free market, people can change the way money and labor is divided. If people have a low time preference and don't want to spend right now, they'll hold money back and not spend. This will drive the interest rate down because there's more money available for banks to loan out. So if the interest rate goes down, it signals to investors that people have changed their time preference and want more capital goods, and it leads to a boom in the capital goods industry. Likewise, if people have a higher time preference and want to spend more, then they are able to take their paycheck out and spend at Walmart or the restaurant or on all these consumer goods, and that will also send a signal to investors, and so there'll be a shift in the division of money and labor. Unfortunately, that's not what we have now. Remember, I said that was in a free market, and we don't have a free market. And here's how it works now. the Federal Reserve adds money, their new money, to the economy, and this drives the interest rate down. And it signals to investors that, well, investors think that the lowered interest rate means that people want more capital goods. So but people have not changed their time preference. They still want the high time preference goods. And we have a problem. Because on the left you see this is what consumers really want. This is how their demand is for consumer goods. But on the right is how investors think it is because of the Federal Reserve's artificially low interest rate. And that's basically what a recession is. This false boom in the capital goods industry has to end. And that's what a recession is, a contraction of this false boom caused by the Federal Reserve. We're going to move on to historical depressions. And basically we're going to look at the government's response to two depressions and how fast the recessions and depressions ended. So the Depression of 1920. A lot of people haven't heard of this depression, and I hadn't until actually just a few months ago, but it's really interesting. From between 1914 and 1920, the money supply doubled. World War I ended, and so the troops came home. This brought unemployment up to 21%, and war production stopped. The year 1920 was actually a worse year economically than the year 1930, and the GDP shrunk 17% in that year. So it was a bad time. It's not like it was much less severe than the Great Depression. It was very bad. So how did the government respond? Well, President Harding responded by cutting the federal budget in half. He also reduced the income tax in all income levels, and he reduced the federal deficit by 1/3. And the Federal Reserve actually in 1920 did nothing to help the economy. They didn't try to stimulate it, they didn't try to bail out businesses, they didn't do anything. So according to politicians, the Depression of 1920 should have lasted, I don't know, 20 years at least. Well, that's not quite what happened. By 1923, unemployment was down to 2.4%, and the economy had readjusted. An economist of the time said something to the effect of during 1920 and 21, they took their losses and suffered, but then they were able to rebuild on a solid foundation again. And the economy was strong, and that was without any government intervention. So let's look now at the Depression of 1929, which has puzzled economists because they can't understand what made it so long and so severe. We have to understand what didn't happen. What didn't happen was a shrinking of the money supply. This is a theory promoted by Milton Friedman and others that there was deflation and the money supply shrunk during the time right before the Great Depression, and that's what caused it. Well, that didn't happen because after the stock market crashed, the Fed pumped massive amounts of money into the market and pushed the interest rate to record lows, which should have stopped the Depression very shortly, according to this theory. But as we know, it didn't. So this theory really isn't plausible. So we have to look at what did happen. And to understand the Great Depression, we have to understand the stock market. What made the stock market so popular during the 20s? Well, you remember we talked about how recessions caused by a boom in the capital goods industry. The stock market value is directly related to capital goods value, which means that if there's a boom in the capital goods industry, then there's a boom in the stock market, and that's what happened during the 20s. However, it was a false boom, and unfortunately people didn't realize this. In fact, only a few weeks before the Great Depression, before the stock market crashed, an economist of the time said stock market prices had reached a permanently high plateau. This was a very popular economist of the time, and he had no clue what was coming. Well, the high plateau that he predicted did crash.